The big event in public spending this year is likely to be the spending review. In September of last year, the previous Chancellor, Sajid Javid, held something of a stopgap spending round, which set departmental settlements just for a single financial year, 2020-21. Typically, these things cover 3, 4, or 5 years. And at some point this year, the Treasury will need to hold another one, because after March of 2021, departmental budgets do not exist, and the spending review will be an opportunity for the government to determine its overall priorities of public spending and allocate funding towards them. In advance of the review, the Chancellor will want to set what's known as the overall spending envelope, which is the total pot of money which would then be allocated between competing departments and public services later in the year. The budget in a few weeks' time will be a natural place for him to do that. He doesn't have to do it in the budget, but it would be an obvious opportunity to set that overall envelope. But as well as deciding on the size of the envelope, the Chancellor will need to decide how broad in scope this year's spending review should be. Just over 40% of total government spending is known in the jargon as departmental expenditure limits. This is spending by departments on public services. You can think about it like that. Most of that, the dark green element there, is day-to-day or resource spending. The remainder is capital or investment spending. These budgets are typically set for multiple years at a time, and we would expect these to be subject to the spending review process, but the Chancellor could be broader in scope. There is precedent for that. So in 2010, George Osborne included large chunks of social security spending within the overall spending review envelope. That accounts for more than a quarter of total spending. The remainder is mainly spending by local and devolved government or spending on debt interest. But today I'm going to start by talking about the dark green part of the pie, so day-to-day spending on public services by departments. As a result of the spending round last September by the previous Chancellor, no departmental budget between this year and next year is facing a real terms cut. All departments will see their budgets rise at least in line with inflation, and some will see them rise by a great deal more. So the NHS in England, for example, is set to receive about £4.5 billion more next year than it has this year. Schools in England will get close to £2 billion, and there's actually lots of money for other areas too. So that includes extra money for things like social care, for prisons, for defence, and for the police. But after next year, we don't have firm departmental plans yet. That's why the government needs to hold a spending review. And we haven't actually had a set of published spending plans from the government since the March of last year, and clearly a great deal has changed in that time. But we can make a pretty good estimate of the spending path implied by their promises, implied by changes since, and implied by their election manifesto. And we know in more detail about some parts of spending. So we know, for example, that the NHS is set to receive about £13 billion more extra over the 3 years from 2021 to 2024, £2.7 billion extra for schools in England, which taken together would mean about £3 billion more for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as a result of the Barnett formula. The government has reiterated its commitment to spending on defence and overseas aid, and taken together, these commitments actually exceed the total implied increase in the day-to-day budget, which would mean making cuts elsewhere. So another way to put that is that unless the Chancellor can find some more money, some budgets will be on the hook for further cuts after 2021. And some of those budgets have already faced deep cuts since 2010. If the Chancellor wished to avoid that scenario, if he found an extra £3 billion or so, he could freeze them in real terms. If he found an extra £6.5 billion, he could increase them in line with the economy and maintain them as a share of GDP. And these aren't huge numbers in the grand scheme of things, particularly not when you look at the whole overall £800 billion government spending pot. But given the lack of room for manoeuvre he has against his current budget balance target, as Isabel laid out, these relatively small figures could still prove to be a headache for the Treasury. And that's especially the case because outside of health, we know that the NHS has been repeatedly protected and prioritised. Spending outside of health has fallen quite substantially, so this shows spending by department. But if we look more generally, day-to-day spending outside of health is currently 21% lower than it was in 2010, 26% lower in per-person terms. And so making further cuts to some of those areas, again, could pose severe challenges for the quality of public services those departments are able to provide. That's the day-to-day side. On investment spending, as Isabel showed you, there's plenty of room to spend more and stay within the government's fiscal targets, and the government has indicated that it will be willing to take advantage of ultra-low interest rates to borrow to increase government investment. It's worth reiterating that existing plans are already set to leave the government maintaining investment spending at a relatively high level by recent historical standards, below the ceiling of 3% of GDP, but some of that gap could be taken up by providing funding to some of those promises in the Conservatives' election manifesto that were not funded at the time. So that includes Northern Powerhouse Rail, it's 34 new hospitals that they've promised to build, but they haven't provided funding towards that yet. So some of that gap could be taken up there. But I think broadly we can expect this budget to promise quite big on investment. But of course, promising big is one thing, delivering big is another. So just to reiterate that one more time, we have quite high investment spending by historical standards, comfortably below that fiscal target ceiling. But if the government did want to push on towards 3% of national income in terms of government investment, and it tried to achieve that quite quickly, we might expect them to struggle to do so. And that's because historically, we know that the government has tended to undershoot on its investment plans. The grey lines here show you planned capital spending in the 1990s, and you can see that it was planned to be cut. The green line shows you what actually happened. So the government cut more than it planned. It undershot those plans. Over the course of the 2000s, the government was planning to increase investment spending at actually quite a rapid rate, but the red line shows you that they, again, were tending to undershoot and increase by less than planned. In more recent years, spending has been cut back again, and again, we've seen an undershooting. So it doesn't matter who's in power, it doesn't matter whether it's going up or going down, the government tends to undershoot these things. In recent years, spending has turned out about 8% lower than it was planned to be just 1 year previously. And if the government seeks an extremely ambitious path for investment spending, we might expect that gap to widen further. As well as the total level of investment, there is clearly growing interest in where that investment goes, particularly given the government's promise to level up across the UK, with particular focus on the possibility of targeting investment at the north of England or at the Midlands. As well as investment varying across the country, so too does spending on public services, so too does spending on benefits, and so too do tax revenues. So I'm going to try and bring all these together and give a sense of how these things vary across the country, why, and what that means for the public finances. So first of all, investment. Everything here is in pounds per head last year in 2018-19. And investment spending per head in London was considerably higher than other parts of England, and Scotland comes a close second, but investment per head is highest in London. It's about 60% higher than the average for the rest of the UK. And a lot of that is driven by higher investment per head in transport. So investment spending on transport in London is about 2.5 times higher than the average for the rest of England. It's worth asking the question how we got to this situation. One argument, not the only argument I want to stress, but one argument is that we got here through conducting a series of rational cost-benefit analyses where a team of civil servants weigh up the various costs and benefits of different projects across the country, given a finite set of resources, and choose those that they think provide the greatest economic return. And because London is a densely populated part of the country with lots of high-paying, highly productive jobs, when you plug those things into one of these models, it suggests that the economic return in London will be greater, particularly given the greater demand for things like public transport, willingness to pay for public transport, and when some of that spending is financed through locally raised taxes and fares. Why might we want to change this? Well, you might think that that rational approach misses some important factors, or you might think that it just inherently takes a static view of the world and favours those areas that already have highly productive jobs, already have dense populations. And it fails to adequately take into account the possibility for dynamic effects and the possibility of changing the productivity path for other parts of the country. But even if you think that the modelling has been done perfectly and it perfectly captures the economic reality, you could make the case that we should care more inherently about the distribution of spending across the country in and of itself. And so you might think about, for example, lowering the benefit cost threshold that projects have to hurdle in other parts of the country, or you might reduce the weighting placed on boosting UK-wide economic growth and place more weighting on trying to help particular groups of people or connecting particular regions, for example. And you could certainly justify a rebalancing of investment through the lens of boosting regional equity, but that would be a political choice to be made. To return to spending per head, that's the dark green part there. We can also look at how spending on public services varies across the country. There's a great deal of variation. It's particularly high in Scotland, in London, and in Wales. Remember that it's more expensive to employ a lot of public sector employees in London. We can also look at how benefit spending varies per head. That's particularly high in Wales and in the northeast of England. And then finally, there's the rest of spending, which is things like defence and debt interests that don't benefit any particular region, which gives us total spending per head across the country. It's clearly higher in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland than it is in England, and it's higher in London and the northeast than it is in other parts of England. Against that, we can plot tax revenues per head. Clearly, there's a great deal of variation there. If I plot on UK average tax revenues per head, you can see that they're only above average in London, the southeast and the east of England, some areas raising far less in tax revenues per head. Now, the gap between those two bars gives us the net fiscal balance for each region, so the difference between how much they raise in tax per person and how much they spend. And London, the southeast and the east of England are running a net fiscal surplus. The rest of the country are running a net fiscal deficit. Those deficits are particularly large in Wales, Northern Ireland and the northeast. So there's clearly some redistribution going on from some parts of the country to others, and we are reliant on those areas that pay in more than they take out. And we're actually increasingly reliant on those areas, and in particular London and the southeast, which reflects a number of changes and factors over time. On the spending side of things, I showed you that spending per head in London is higher than in other parts of the country. That's actually less the case now than it used to be. In part, that's because a greater and greater share of what government does is providing healthcare and pensions, and that tends to be higher in areas of the country where there's more old people. So whereas about 12% of the London population is 65 and above, it's more like 20 or 21% in Wales, the northeast and the southwest. Local authorities in London have also faced particularly deep cuts to their budgets since 2010. And on the tax side of things, our tax revenues are increasingly concentrated in that part of the country. That's partly because increases in property values and rents have fed through to higher revenues from stamp duty, for example, or business rates. A growing share of those with very high incomes, a growing share of the ultra-rich tend to live in London and the southeast, and those people tend to pay quite a lot in tax. And there's also been policy changes, so stamp duty, income tax and inheritance tax have all been made more progressive with respect to their tax bases, and that burden has fallen predominantly on, or more relatively on, London and the southeast. Finally, I want to look at benefit spending, which, as I showed you at the start, is more than a quarter of total government spending. It's a big part of what government does, and it could be part of the spending review process. The story of the last decade has really been that despite some quite big cuts to the generosity of the working age benefit system, and despite substantial policy reforms, including raising the state pension age, the government has only succeeded in maintaining social security spending in real terms. It hasn't actually managed to reduce it because of underlying pressures pushing it up. It would be higher in the absence of those reforms, but they've only really managed to keep it flat. Looking ahead, the benefits freeze has now come to an end, so those working age benefits that were previously frozen in cash terms will now increase in line with inflation. There are no further real terms cuts or giveaways planned. But there are two major working age benefit cuts still working their way through the system, which affect low-income families with children. So the two-child limit is expected to affect about 750,000 families. It means that they'll no longer receive support for their third, fourth, fifth, and so on children. And getting rid of the family premium will affect about 3.2 million families eventually. And combined, we expect this to save about 4.4 billion, of which about 5/6 or 3.7 billion is still to come. And the big one, of course, is universal credit, the full rollout of which has been delayed, perhaps not for the last time. And when universal credit is eventually fully rolled out, it will create millions of losers and millions of winners, and we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. So to conclude, we don't have firm government spending plans, but the spending path implied by their manifesto leaves a considerable amount of austerity baked in, particularly for those departments that have already faced deep cuts since 2010. And indeed, if the Chancellor doesn't find additional funding, some of them may have to make further savings after next year. Mr. Sunak could provide some additional money to avoid that scenario, and the budget would be a natural point for him to set his overall spending envelope, but he could do it at another point, and then later in the year we'll have a spending review to finalise allocations between departments and between public services. There is plenty of scope for additional capital spending within the government's fiscal rules, but remember that promising a boost to investment is certainly much easier than actually delivering it. And if the government wants to target investment in particular parts of the country, it should think carefully about the rules that determine where that investment goes. And working age benefit cuts are still working their way through the system. universal credit has been delayed again, but ultimately will affect millions of families across the UK. Thank you very much.